Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Worthington. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Lindamood-Bell Learning Processes. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a brief discussion going over what we think are some pretty important findings over the last, I'm going to say, 25 years regarding some new science and results that have emerged on addressing dyslexia. And we think it's pretty important information to know. And a quick word from Nancy Bell, CEO at Lindamood-Bell here. We've always believed, and now we have evidence, that all individuals can be taught to read to their potential, including dyslexics. Dyslexia does not have to be a lifelong challenge, and thus many learning challenges do not have to be tolerated by so many children. That's kind of a bold statement, but I think that when you have a chance to look at this, it'll be fun to get your view on the findings from this research that we've been engaged in, both in terms of our affiliation and our collaborations with universities across the country, as well as work that we've done here at home. Just a quick overview on what we're going to cover. We've got some new information related to the science that we've been involved in. We're going to talk about and officially make the case that there's a profound and defensible theory called dual coding theory that goes along with what we refer to as symbol imagery as it relates to addressing the needs of dyslexics. We're going to specifically talk about 3 lines of research at the University of Washington, Georgetown, and MIT on the research that we've done on dyslexia in those institutions. And then I'm going to end with a longitudinal look, 10 years of data that we've been tracking on dyslexics that have been, that we've had the pleasure of working with here at Lindamood-Bell, ending with what we think are future directions for more research. The gentleman that we've worked with, Dr. Jason Yateman, at the University of Washington, makes the following statement. While many parents and teachers might worry that dyslexia is permanent, reflecting intrinsic deficits in the brain, these findings demonstrate, and those are findings that I'll be going over briefly with you, that targeted intensive reading programs not only lead to substantial improvements in reading, but also changes in the underlying wiring of the brain's reading circuitry. Before we get into the numbers and the findings from that research, I'm going to show you a quick video of one of the students' families that was involved in that study up at the University of Washington.
He loves to joke and play and laugh. School isn't necessarily on his top list of things that he enjoys doing. His teacher recognized that he wasn't progressing the same as the rest of the students. And she had, lots of experience with students with challenges and recommended that we start looking into how we can get support for him outside of the classroom. One of our friends has another friend with a child with dyslexia who participated in the University of Washington study. Once I read more about it, we applied, and then that's how we, got connected with Lindamood-Bell.
First they went over, then visited all the parents who were in there, kind of an orientation kind of thing, and they kind of laid it out how it was, and they just communicated so well.
They described it as looking for neural pathways, that the dyslexic brain uses different paths into the parts of the brain that you need to retain information for reading. And for reading to be easy, you need to be able to hold on to those symbols in your brain. And before the study, if Kai was reading a book and it had the word cat on the first page, and then that word was repeated, he would have to literally sound out the word the next time he saw it, and the next time he saw it, and the next time he saw it. And so his brain was working really hard every time he had to read because it was correct every time. We had 4 different study visits with an MRI. We then did an evaluation at Lindamood-Bell and learned even more about the Seeing Stars program, and that was also helpful. With the air writing and other ways of retaining those symbols and images in his brain, it became automatic, so it wasn't work anymore because of the neural pathways that he built.
It's funny as we learned about the whole thing, because I'm dyslexic, grew up dyslexic, and there wasn't the kind of program that Lindamood-Bell put on there, so it was just a lot of hard work and always a struggle. So seeing just the improvement from day 1 to the end of the program for Kai was amazing, and literally areas that I never got to growing up. So it's pretty cool. I mean, and when they're describing what the brain does and how he sees things, is like, oh my gosh, it all makes sense to me.
We knew that Kai had really accomplished a big commitment and big effort. So we wanted to celebrate that. And where he was participating, it was a short walk to a place where we could park our boat. So we brought our boat, we traveled by boat, and then walked up to the school, and he did his 4 hours of session. And then after, when he came down to the boat, it was all decorated with streamers and balloons, and we had, a toast and celebrated his accomplishment.
Well, it's amazing that in an 8-week period, you can go from being that far behind to level.
Yeah,
where you're supposed
or
to be.
ahead.
Or ahead, which is like, it was mind-boggling.
We scheduled a meeting for him to sit down with his teacher and 2 of the special ed teachers and go through, this is the new Kai. I know, here's the Kai that you knew before the summer, and this is where he is now. It was amazing.
So, what is this new information? Emerging neuroscientific and behavioral research offers renewed hope, we think, in addressing the needs of individuals with dyslexia, including those diagnosed with severe dyslexia. This research reveals that what we're referring to as sensory cognitive function of symbol imagery improves phoneme awareness, and it's necessarily the flip side of the coin of phoneme awareness is necessary for both phonological and the orthographic components of reading. Research also indicates an instructional model to address both the phonological and orthographic components of reading, resulting in significant gains in reading for dyslexics. And that's really the process that we went through at the University of Washington and the other studies that I'll be reviewing. Some of you may be familiar with Lindamood-Bell's paradigm of reading on the component parts and how we look at that, how we have looked at that over the last 30 years. And again, referring to sensory cognitive functions that underlie the necessary components of reading: auditory, visual, and language. Addressing those in turn, we think, and research suggests that the auditory component, or what people typically refer to as phonological processing, for example, in being able to look at a word for the first time and read it fluently, is a critical component. We've also known intuitively, and some research has suggested that, but I'm going to get a little deeper into this, that the orthographic processing for word recognition and fluency in reading is a huge component that stands side by side with the auditory component. And last but not least, we know that we've got to have good vocabulary and contextual reading. all of those are subcomponents of the important skill of language comprehension. What happened over time, in fact, this little quote from Nancy kind of sets the stage on why we've adjusted our thinking and what the research suggests in terms of the comparative roles between these three components. She says that we consistently noted significant gains in phonemic awareness. This was before we started using specific symbol imagery or stimulating the orthographic component of reading and word attack. However, our students continue to struggle with word recognition and paragraph reading. That was really of concern to us. They demonstrated slow and tedious word attack skills. Word recognition did not improve as much as the word attack. And so, obviously, contextual reading was affected, and contextual fluency remained substantially below their potential. They had difficulty memorizing sight words, and frequently they would just read word by word without any fluency in their decoding. So, in concert with these findings, we became aware of, now a long time ago, of dual coding theory. And what's interesting about this is that the theory, by definition, simply means that cognition is proportional to the extent that the coding mechanisms of mental representations, or imagery broadly interpreted, and language are integrated. Dr. Alan Pavio, who spent the better part of his professional life at the University of Ontario, suggested that linguistic competence and performance are based on a substrate of imagery. More importantly, it turns out that these individuals, in fact all individuals, differ in the extent, manner, and efficiency of employment in each of the systems according to their verbal and nonverbal habits and skills. Well, it turns out that we now can make we knew that for language comprehension, and Nancy Bell, when she wrote Visualizing and Verbalizing for language comprehension and thinking, it turns out that the model seems to be equally related to decoding skills, and especially in the remediation of dyslexia. The 7th edition of this, what's classically used as a college text on the theoretical models and process of illiteracy, there's a chapter in there written by Martin Sigdowski where he specifies a little bit more on the relationship of DCT in terms of it being among the strongest and current candidates for developing a unified, scientifically based theory of literacy. Of course, that would include dyslexia. He goes on to say that the principles of DCT apply to grapheme, phoneme correspondences, vocabulary, grammar, the construction of mental models, etc. So, what does that mean in terms of our work with dyslexic individuals? It provides a unified account of all aspects of reading under a common set of principles. As we shall see, the same basic DCT principles apply to grapheme, phoneme correspondences, as I've already said, just re-emphasizing that whole point, that it's critically related to what we see on the decoding side of the equation in addressing the needs of people who have a hard time reading. Well, what we wound up addressing for orthographic processing turned out to be, the simple view of that was just a simple, call it symbol imagery. And it's simply the ability to create mental imagery for sounds, not just letters, but sounds within words. And again, that being a sensory cognitive function for the processes necessary for decoding. What's that look like? If I were to show you this simple nonsense single syllable word, if you look at it, and then I take that away, and you're holding into working memory what the combination of those letters are, and I ask you to reverse the P and the S, what would the word say? Well, that requires a mental manipulation for you to be able to wind up saying the word correctly. And that's all that really is. And we take that for granted, but as we've already indicated, what Pavio suggests is that there are enormous individual differences in the ability to process the orthographic patterns as there are to be able to auditorily perceive sounds from a phonological standpoint. Just to add a piece of other research, Virginia Berninger noted that the role of weak orthographic processing in disabled readers goes something like this. It's been clearly shown that skilled readers code the visual information in printed words. Disabled readers may fail to code that visual information efficiently or sufficiently. And where does reading land? If we read fluently, that means we have automatic recognition for letter patterns and syllables and multisyllables, and we can decode. The ultimate goal is we can decode print as quickly as we would normally speak. Nancy's indication is that there are individual differences in symbol imagery, and those differences impact the coding of printed words, and thus orthographic and phonological processing in literacy skills. We got so serious about that, said our next research question is that something that we can measure? Is that something that we can test for? And it turns out that we went ahead and engaged in an enormous effort to develop a test called the symbol imagery test. And I'm just going to show you briefly some of the correlations. If you look at, for example, a reading fluency test that includes comprehension, the Gray oral reading test, and you take a look at the SI correlations on that, on the relationship of being able to manipulate letters and sounds within syllables, the correlations are very high. It turns out it's the same for the Slauson oral reading test, which is simply a word recognition test. We double check that, and how's it do with spelling? Again, very high, and also word attack. So when we normed the test, we actually compared it, among other things, to our own Lindamood auditory conceptualization test to see how does it correlate with a test of phonological processing. Very high. We went ahead and looked at the CTOP, the comprehensive test of phonological skills, and you can see the relationship there. Sure enough, in phonological awareness, rapid naming of digits and letters, it falls out to have the same high correlations. But that doesn't necessarily mean cause and effect. That's just the relationship of it. We next, in the nationally normed research that we did, we conducted a stepwise regression. All that means is how well do the classic tests associated with testing for dyslexia relate to one another in terms of their power to predict performance. The SI test, when you look at word attack, word recognition, spelling, reading rate, accuracy, and fluency, you can look across the top and you can see the comparative contribution that the SI test makes relative to the LAC test and the subtests on the CTOP. That was a revelation to us. We didn't expect that. It turns out to be extremely powerful when you're looking at the correlation, or sorry, the regressions against those particular skills. Well, I referred to the work that we've done at the University of Washington. The best way to refer to that is simply by referring to it as a combination of neurological and behavioral research on dyslexia. Really important to use randomized controls on this. This was part of a longitudinal effort that we engaged in. We've done 9 studies overall with the University of Washington, MIT, and Georgetown. First, the University of Washington. We researched, Jason Yateman and his colleagues did an intervention, a randomized controlled intervention research study focusing on the brain connectivity, what's going on in those areas that are classically associated with a dyslexic profile. These were all dyslexic students, and it used a longitudinal intervention designed to examine what he called the experience-dependent growth in reading skills and white matter. White matter simply being the connective tissue in the brain where You have, for example, the phonological area of the brain communicating with the orthographic area of the brain. In grade school age, struggling readers, dyslexics, they used MRI technology after 8 weeks of intensive intervention. That was 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. And the measurements revealed large-scale changes throughout a collection of white matter tracts. In summary, they improved these students, on average, 1 full grade level for those who took part in the study to develop both their symbol imagery for phonological and orthographic processing. The data collected during the instruction indicated that there were large-scale changes in the white matter conductivity correlating to the gains in reading. What that simply means is that there was a better relationship in those areas of the brain necessary for communication as a result of the intervention. There's a second study, quickly. Again, using the same intensive reading intervention with dyslexic, and they found that the interventions introduced large changes in the white matter again, but the magnitude and the time course of plasticity, and this was the important finding on this, did not depend on the subject age. And that's kind of counterintuitive. We've always thought that older students, you know, it was harder to change the conductivity, but it turns out to be that not to be the case. And they conclude that for the intensive one-on-one reading intervention program employed, using again symbol imagery, there is a sensitive period, but it does not end before middle school. This doesn't say much more than that, but the important consideration is it calls into question on the developmental issue of the issues about plasticity. We know at the onset of early age, plasticity, theoretically at least, it's always much easier to change children's brains, but this is very hopeful in terms of being able to address the needs of dyslexics as they move on through school. And the third study is referred to as a mixed effects model on the longitudinal measurements revealed, and this is kind of it's a nuance, but it's really important, a linear dose relationship between hours of intervention and the improvement in reading ability. Sharon Vaughn and folks down at the University of Texas in Houston and others have been saying the same thing that we've been practicing over the last 30 years, that it's absolutely critical that there's an important relationship, even if you know what the deficit is and what to do about it, that children who are 1 or more standard deviations below the mean need intensive intervention. In other words, there is now evidence that we have this linear dose response to the relationship between the hours of intervention and improvement in reading ability. And so that was the third component that came out of those longitudinal studies that we did at Washington. Very quickly, at Georgetown University, and actually this is one of the first studies that we did in collaboration with Dr. Guinevere Eden at the Center for the Study of Learning there. She noted that the result of the same intervention that we did with the folks at the University of Washington was that there were substantial gray matter volume changes following the reading intervention. So this was different than the white matter changes. The gray matter simply meaning we're increasing the number of neurons in the gray matter dedicated to the particular task at hand, that being able to decode fluently. The study involved 11 children, again, 8 weeks of intervention, and what you see there are the significant findings on their auditory conceptualization or their phonemic awareness, their symbol imagery, word recognition, indeed their word attack, rapid naming, and their the cool part about this was that actually we saw significant changes as a result of improving their decoding. There were substantial changes in their language comprehension. They identified specifically, if you're interested in the neuroscience part of this, those changes were in 4 areas of the brain, in the left hemisphere, and also in those areas of the brain associated with episodic memory, visual spatial processing, etc. Finally, on that particular study, what was especially important from our standpoint is that when they took measurements post-intervention after the 8 weeks, one of the questions that we've always been faced with is, do those gains hold? Is there maintenance, or do they regress? Do they move ahead? And what this shows, in those areas where they documented increased gray matter volume changes, over time, when they remeasured, they found that the changes continue to increase. So, conclusion, training-induced changes in the gray matter volume can be observed in a pediatric sample for the first time. This is based on the information that came right out of the paper. The improvements resulted from the intervention are accompanied by increases in gray matter, and both reading improvements, and those changes are maintained in the training period, and I should have noted on that, beyond. How about MIT? We've done a couple studies. I'm just going to highlight one of them. All these studies, by the way, are on our website, on a striking finding, actually, when the folks at MIT, John Gabrielli and his colleagues, took a look at not only the same kind of intervention over a similar period of time, and again, looking at functional brain changes, but what happens when we looked at it from a socioeconomic standpoint. 65 children involved in the study with diverse socioeconomic status characterizations, and they were assigned to an intensive 6-week summer program. These were younger children, by the way, first, second grade. And before and after, they were all completely, we conducted the standardized reading interventions and assessments, took some images, and at baseline, the higher SES correlated with greater vocabulary and greater cortical thickness. That simply means their brains looked different than the lower SES in those particular areas. What's even more interesting, when we took a look post-intervention, the lower SES kids were associated with both greater reading improvements and greater cortical thickening across broad, bilateral, occipitotemporal areas, etc. And they indicate that effective summer reading intervention is coupled with cortical growth, which is fascinating and is especially beneficial for children with reading disabilities who come from lower SES home environments. What that means is, and this is consistent with what we've seen in our work in schools, etc., is that SES, lower SES, I should say, is not a liability. There's no reason children can't be caught up in their reading skills regardless of their income bracket. Finally, just a quick note. I mentioned earlier that in addition to the neuroscientific work that we're doing in collaboration with those universities, we've been looking at our internal population of dyslexics for the last 10 years. We tracked this clinical data on those individuals that were previously diagnosed or identified as dyslexics before they came to one of our centers throughout the United States, England, and Australia. And then we took that profile for those kids and we did a matched control to students who had a similar profile. In other words, they had the same profile as being a dyslexic, but they had not been previously identified. And we then compared that to the students in the UW dyslexic students that I referred to earlier. Overall, if we took a look at this, see if I can highlight this for you. There were over 7,000 students over this, this period of time. In group 1, these are the kids that I just talked about in the UW study. In group 2, these kids were previously diagnosed. We had 1,700 in that category. And it turns out that we had over 5,000 children who had never been diagnosed as dyslexic, but they, upon the assessment protocols, they have a dyslexic profile. To the question of whether or not these individuals could be remediated, we knew going into this that we had good gains, as evidenced by what I've already talked about in the University of Washington study. But if you look at their profile, the mean hours of instruction, other than the neuroscientific group, those kids got more instruction on hours. There's the percent male-female ratio, the mean age was approximately the same. In fact, statistically the same. When we look at their profile, on all the tests that we looked at, symbol imagery, phonemic awareness, word attack, word recognition, spelling, rate, accuracy, fluency, their comprehension. We even looked at their ability to follow oral directions and their vocabulary. As you can see, if we look at that language circle, their vocabulary all up around the 75th percentile. All these children had enormous potential in terms of their receptive oral vocabulary. And sure enough, they all have extremely similar profiles when we look at their ability to decode, for example, especially in that area of word recognition, where there are substantial deficits as compared to their word knowledge. At post-intervention, overall, with on the average 104 hours of instruction, when we look at all 7,000 students, based upon pre and post percentiles, there are the gains from the pre-profile. In the case of word recognition, they went from the 27th percentile into the normal range of functioning at large up to the 50th percentile, which simply means that they're doing on average as well as the general population throughout the United States on that particular test. All these tests, by the way, were statistically significant. If we look at it from a standard score growth standpoint, there they are. All of them extremely significant standard scores with a moderate standard score in spelling and rate, but nonetheless, important growth. And again, this is for all 7,000 students. A quick way to disaggregate that would be to say, well, if we look at whether or not all these children on based on their dyslexic profile were essentially in the first quartile. In other words, in a typical distribution on a bell curve, they're all below the 25th percentile. Our question was, if we look at these students and we look at the tests that are classically associated with their profile, that profile being dyslexic, how many of them were we able to get out of the first quartile on those particular assessments? Again, let's, for example, focus on word recognition, one of the classic markers of reading in a disabled category for dyslexic. On the all quartile increase, 1,600 of those kids of the 7,000 on that particular test, if you look at an all quartile increase across the board on not only increasing one quartile, but two quartiles or even three quartiles, over 60%, over half the population left that first category of being in the first quartile. That shows extremely positive results in meeting the needs of a dyslexic population. And you can see the numbers associated with the rest of those tests. If you think about the fact that they only had 104 hours, our question, of course, is, what if they had 200 hours? Which way would that percentage increase? If that dose-response relationship that we found in those studies is true, that means we could legitimately hypothesize that the increases would be significant as we moved students into more and more intensive intervention. Why does that matter? Well, just a week and a half ago, coincidentally, I ran across this quote in a newspaper, in one of my news feeds out of Asheville, North Carolina. Research estimates 80% of all learning disabilities are a form of dyslexia. By the way, this is entitled, the article is entitled, Millions of Students Have Dyslexia, Can All Receive the Specialized Instruction They Need? Well, sadly, but not surprisingly, The second sentence in that quote out of this article says that the condition is genetic and never goes away. That calls into question what Jason alluded to in the first part of the presentation. Our position is clear. It's not necessarily a terminal disease. It's not necessarily something that we have to compensate for, and where dyslexics have to learn to live with it the rest of their life. So, the findings on this particular one are they demonstrate the efficacy of the intensive intervention to develop what we call, again, those sensory cognitive functions. They validate the tenets of dual coding theory, that phonological and orthographic or phonemic awareness and letter-sound relationships are coded together to increase the fluency of reading skills for children who have dyslexia. They are consistent with the current neuroscientific investigations that I just outlined, using the instructional methodology to develop symbol imagery, orthographic and phonemic processing as associated with their reading skills. So, having concluded or summarized these issues, I'd like to show you a final little video clip that really goes kind of to the voice of dyslexia, hearing from families and or children that are in the mix of trying to address that for their reading skills that we know are all too important.
So they didn't really know what to do with me back then, and they didn't know what was actually going wrong in my head. And then I was finally diagnosed with severe dyslexia when I was a senior in high school. I was termed mentally retarded, and so I didn't get the right type of services that I needed.
The grade 1 teacher at the time called me. I said to her, I'm having some troubles taking Tallulah to school. She was crying in the morning at school. I just said to the teacher, you're going to have to work out what's going on. You have to help me work out what's going on. And she rang me a few days later and she said, I've done some tests on Tallulah. I think she might have dyslexia. That's why my bright, competent, social, confident, amazingly gifted in terms of her vocabulary child can't read.
He couldn't really read. He had a difficulty writing, and he was feeling very, very insecure and very sad about school. And it was very difficult for me because I got my master's in education, so I was third generation school teacher, but I just couldn't help him. And what he needed was something that I wasn't trained in, which was more special needs for dyslexia, dysgraphia, and Lindamood-Bell was able to give that to him.
So Seeing Stars is about, it's about showing children how to visualize in their head words and what they look like and then what they sound like. So words and sounds and combinations of sounds. That's my understanding of Seeing Stars. When we did the assessment, we showed our individual needs teacher at the school that Tallulah is at, and she said, looking at Tallulah now, in terms of her comprehension and her reading ability, I wouldn't even see a dyslexic profile.
Started off with a 5th grade reading level and math, and then I ended up graduating out of Lindamood-Bell after 2 college semesters with college grade reading level. And then I went into Cal Poly as a full-time student.
After 3 weeks here with the Seeing Stars program, he jumped from 2nd grade reading to 5th grade reading. So it was incredible.
So I went in and I watched her work with the teacher for the first time, and it's still emotional now because I remember I distinctly remember sitting there thinking, my daughter couldn't read on Monday and now she can read. It was just, sorry. I was so proud of her. And I was so pleased that we had made the sacrifice that we had made, and so relieved that it turned out to be the right choice. 5 days, yep.
Finally, just a couple words about what we're thinking about in the future. While these are all encouraging and we are enjoying this new science and the conclusions that we've been able to make from these findings, we're especially interested in both the genetic and the epigenetic questions, digging deeper into this neuroplasticity. You know, the nature-nurture debate has been out there for a long time, and how genes are expressed, especially from the onset of early childhood, where reading considerations are concerned, is a critical question for us into the future. Knowing that we can change white matter, we can increase gray matter, what can we now do to increase the successes that we've already had? We want to do more research on dual coding theory, especially on what is now being characterized as this underconnectivity hypothesis. And all that really means is, could it be that in terms of deficits being associated with poor phonemic awareness or poor symbol imagery or orthographic processing, maybe it's as much an issue about the connectivity, that those areas of the brain are not connected. And the research that's come out of the University of Washington relative to that really begs a question about the accuracy of our cause and effect relationship in understanding dyslexia. We're especially interested in comorbidity. We currently have a study with Georgetown. Guinevere Eden is continuing to look at reading, but reading's relationship to mathematics. Are they part and parcel of the same thing? Are they different? If we put students through interventions in mathematics, what happens to the reading skills, etc. And we're especially interested in applied research in public ed. We had an enormous project with the University of Colorado and Center School District in Center, Colorado, where Haskin Elementary School was in the lower 5% of the state. We spent 3 years there. We moved, assisted through professional development in the programs that we've just referred to, in moving Haskin Elementary School in Center, Colorado, to the highest quartile in the state. We've currently got fantastic research going on. We've had 4 years of work done in University of Alabama in Birmingham with Rajesh Khanna and his colleagues studying the effects of learning disabilities, particularly in the language comprehension area with children on the autism spectrum. And I'm happy to announce that this coming year we'll be starting another longitudinal study on dyslexia with Stanford University. I want to thank you for your time. I hope you have found this information useful. If you do have any questions, feel free to contact us here at Lindamood-Bell. If you'd like to chat with me about these findings, happy to do so, or please go on our website. All this information is, at least where the neuroscience part of it is concerned, is documented there. Thank you.